Why England?
Why England? Let's start with that, okay? Today's lecture, if you will, is going to be based on that. It's 3 parts. And I literally wrote the essay for you in note format. So we're going to go over that, but I want to show you where it is, and then I want to explain it. And then we'll give you a preview to essay number 2, which is Necessity is the Mother of Invention. And we can look at the innovators and how the innovators innovated in areas that there was a problem that needed to be solved, and that the innovations were driven by solving said problem. So go into Google Drive, go into Academic, Euro, Unit 6, Notes. You following so far, Lauren? Industrial Revolution Notes. And then one that says AP Euro Notes British Industrial Advantage. It's pretty self-explanatory. Okay? Yesterday I told you that there was a couple of different things that you could read. One of them was McKay. Does anybody remember the page numbers?
600. Chapter 21. 630.
It's chapter 20 now.
638.
648 to 667.
No,
All right? The other one, which is a good source, is Spielvogel chapter 21. Okay, you remember me saying that? That's a really good source for that. And Spielvogel is at the very beginning of the chapter. It literally says the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. So it's going to talk about a lot of these things, and then we'll kind of fill in the gaps for more we go here. Okay? But this is the question, and if you guys were so blessed to receive this question as an essay question, you ought to destroy it, because there's going to be like multiple responses to every paragraph. So the first one is, why did England have the enormous gap that it did in industrial production? And I told you yesterday that it's probably unprecedented in modern history how big a gap that was. And even threw out some like trivia, like 2/3 of the world's coal. 1/2 of the world's manufactured goods came out of England. The entire world, half of the goods came out of England. Nickname, Workshop of the World. There was even a stat that I read that it said its textile industry alone was larger than all of the other industries of all of the other nations combined. That's sick, right? That's like Steph Curry at the beginning of the Warriors game the other night when he had gotten off of his injury. If anybody was there for that, he was 10 for 13 from three-point land, had 38 points in 30 minutes. Not bad. Okay, he had it going on. Britain had it going on in 1850. All right, so the question is how and why. And so that's where we're going to get in here a little bit. This question is similar to the Northern Italian Renaissance question that you might get, the why here of all places do we have this flourishing of sculptors and thinkers and painters and architects? Or the question was, why did the Netherlands have this insane advantage during the middle of the 17th century? All right, but for England right now, this is going to make them the dominant world power. And really the 19th century belongs to England. All right, and it really doesn't go away until after World War I. So, number one, it says Britain's colonial empire. This is something that gives them a gap. All right, why? Because they've got markets. What do colonies, what do they provide? Remember, England is a naval, commercial, and colonial power. Now, as they build this industrial revolution, as they shift to mechanization, as they start mass producing a whole bunch of heavy things, textiles, steel, iron, coal, ultimately railroads, shipping, a variety of other things, they've got places where that stuff can go. All right? Even if Europe is kind of flaky, and there are times where they'll be flaky, Britain's got markets in India. They got markets in Latin America. They got markets in North America. They got the transatlantic slave trade. So if there's labor production, they've got that. Okay? And remember, what a colony offers is a variety of things. One, raw materials. So if Britain doesn't make those materials, and they are sitting on a lot, that they can get them, and they can get them cheaply. All right, they don't have to buy them, they take them because it's their colony. All right, also labor, available, cheap labor. The other is land. And then the other is that they have markets for finished products. There's a lot of population that is under British control. And just like India, they basically screwed them out of their own native textile industry and forced them to buy imports from Britain. All right, they could do that in a variety of different places. Okay, number 2, entrepreneurial spirit. And this is the part where you can like name drop. All right, just the amount of talent that was there, and it was talent that was willing to take risks. It was talent that was driven to try to provide the eureka innovation, and that the other part of it is that it was supported by the government. They didn't see their entrepreneurial assets as like a challenge the way that landowning aristocrats on the continent would. They saw them as people that were ultimately going to make everybody else better. Okay? The way America does, the way that we open up our arms and welcome the talent from all over the world to immigrate to this country. Right? So, John Kay, Hargreaves, Crompton, Arkwright, they are all related to the textile industry. Jethro Tull, Bakewell, Thompson, Young, they're all related to agricultural innovations. Bessemer, George Stephenson, James Watt, the guy that made the steam engine. All right, Thomas Savery, Thomas Newcomen, William Siemens, the list goes on and on and on. All right, and it says Britain's government seemed to encourage and support its entrepreneurial assets. All right, it's the difference. Like even when Britain was mercantilist, they were different in the way that they were mercantilist. Like the government was actually shepherding the talents of the middle class. It wasn't nearly as patriarchal as like the Colbert version of mercantilism that existed in France in the age of absolutism. Number 3, this is kind of a standalone one. Adam Smith comes from Britain. Period. All right. Does everybody understand? This is kind of a big deal. It's one of those where I would say I would bet my mortgage that there would be a question on the AP exam about Adam Smith. He's that important. All right. Economic liberalism, the idea that individuals and individual initiative, if free and unfettered and allowed to compete in the marketplace, is ultimately going to drive all kinds of economic progress. It's going to make more stuff. It's going to lower prices. It's going to bring more people into the marketplace. All right? Yay, capitalism. Okay? Capitalism is, has a founding father. It's Adam Smith. All right? Number 4, location. Location, location, location. England's got location. They are an island. Okay? They're an island that is protected. Okay? And the way that I'm going to give you Donald Trump. It is an island.
Oh, God.
Surrounded by water. Big water. Ocean water. Okay? That's a big deal. What's big about it is that they've got this massive navy that protects it and patrols it. They have a massive navy that can also protect their commercial assets. They also have navigable water sources within Britain that can get goods quickly to waterways, that can get goods quickly to seaports, that can get goods all over the world. All right, that's part of it. There's a stat that says that nowhere in England was there a manufacturing center that was ever more than 20 miles away from a navigable water source. So even as the railroad was like a primitive thing that they were building on, they were still able to put a lot of mucho stuff out there because they could get it on the waterways. And waterways were the commercial arteries before air travel, obviously. Actually, they still are the arteries. Natural resources. That's the other thing that England had in abundance, was that they were sitting on massive deposits of natural resources. The things that were going to drive the Industrial Revolution: coal, steel, iron ore, and then textiles. They were full of sheep. Sheep have wool. Wool turns into sweaters. Okay? Sweaters could get sent all over the world. All right? They have a homegrown manufacturing base. So if the colonial empire doesn't fit, they're already sitting on massive industries where the natural resource deposits are in their backyard. Okay? The United States had that advantage. Germany had that advantage. Russia has that advantage. Okay? China has that advantage. God bless you. Okay? The second one is like you can literally see like the evolution from the agricultural revolution to the industrial revolution. If the agricultural revolution really began in Britain, then all of those like transitions are also happening in Britain first. Agricultural revolution begets the demand for manufactured goods because people are no longer spending all of their income on agricultural products. The bread prices are low, they can spend it on manufactured goods. The population increases and is healthy and more sustainable because the agricultural revolution is keeping people healthier and they can live longer. And they've got this massive boom in the 18th century. We know that the British Parliament started to enclose lands, right? That put peasants who had kind of lived in, set their watch by the commons and other places where they could grow food. And now all of a sudden they're kind of fluid. Either A, they become the mom and pop textile shops, or B, they become what's known as rural proletariat. Rural laborers that are mobile enough to go to wherever the jobs are. They're not tied to the land in the way that like serfs in Central and Eastern Europe were. Okay? So they're on the evolutionary scale, that's kind of where they are. It's like one group is hunters and gatherers and this group is space age. And England's kind of like space age right now. All right? Number 7 is what I was talking about. That labor force made up of hired agricultural laborers. The Enclosure Acts created a whole bunch of those folks. Not every single peasant that was a victim of the Enclosure Acts became a mom and pop textile shop. A lot of them were just wage earners. All right, and that means that they were a mobile force. So once mechanization happens, and I told you before that mechanization is ultimately going to put large machines in centrally located areas and was going to force a demographic shift, those people were already kind of up and had their bags packed. They were ready for that. Okay, would have been a hell of a lot harder to do in, I don't know, Transylvania. Right? Number 8, 1588. Okay, that's another one of those kind of period. If you remember that date and how important that is in English history, that's the part where the English defeated the Spanish Armada, but it was pretty much a symptom of the fact that Britain is protected. They literally have a curtain around themselves, and that it means that they can deal with their own issues on their own time without worry about what everybody else is up to. If they want to intervene, they can intervene, but they don't have to worry incessantly about invasion, about armies like rolling through their territories. So it kind of gives them a skill, all right, that they can kind of set their own agenda. They already dealt with the religious wars and they dealt with their political revolution, and fully 100 years before anybody else did. All right, so then they can move on to the next thing, and that next thing was the agricultural and industrial revolution. Everybody else is still trying to figure out government. Right? The government that England figured out in 1688 predominantly is the government they got now. All right, been there, done that. Okay, they have the security in being able to develop at their own pace without interference. Number 9 is not historically accurate, which sucks, because it would be great if it were true. Because then I could say that like Napoleon was responsible for everything. Okay. Napoleon was like the midwife that birthed the ideals of the French Revolution to the rest of the world. But I could also say that Napoleon, because he was so salty about not being able to invade and occupy Britain, that he put up this massive tariff on continental Europe that said, don't anybody trade with Britain. Anybody remember what it's called? Continental system, right? So the argument would be like this, if this were true, that Britain was forced, because of the continental system, to adapt to the fact that maybe they had become dependent on imports that only places in continental Europe could have provided. One of the things that you'll read about tomorrow is that there was a fuel shortage in England that ultimately hastened the switch from forest or wood to coal in terms of burning energy. Okay? And coal and burning energy in coal, and the fact that coal was in mines and they had to dig for it, and ultimately they dug deep enough that they got to water tables, and ultimately those water tables flooded the mines, and ultimately they had to figure out how they were going to get the water out of the mines. That led to the creation of the steam engine. All right? But what if that didn't happen? What if there wasn't a problem that needed to be solved? What if Napoleon had not put a gigantic tariff around continental Europe, and the British could import timber like they were from Russia and Finland and other places in Scandinavia, but that those markets were shut off to Britain during a period of time? If all of that were true, then you could make the argument that Napoleon is responsible for Watt's steam engine. Except that the continental system was created in 1807 and the steam engine was invented in 1769. Right? But who knows? Couldn't you effectively tell that story though? And then just leave out that one detail about how one of them happened 40 years before the other? Either way, all right, they did innovate, but they didn't innovate because of Napoleon. They innovated because they ran out of wood, and that coal burned a hell of a lot longer and more energy than wood ever did. But yeah, they had deforested throughout the 18th century. Number 10, England's isolation afforded refugees the ability to contribute to economic progress in exchange for their protection. That England was sort of like exile central. All right, that if people were facing like fear of political reprisal or whatever, a lot of them ended up in England, and a lot of the people that ended up in England weren't like the worst people, the rapists or whatever. They were innovators in some cases, like the Netherlands, being a place that was open and tolerant and that was receptive to having people of different ideas and different religious beliefs that could come and contribute to the overall health of the economy. England was kind of in that spot. So that though, the middle class that might be like leaving because of political turmoil in one place could be warmly received in England, and then ultimately they contribute something. Okay? It's always nice to be welcoming of the people around you, that might be fleeing really, really awful situations, because they might actually contribute to the overall health of the country. Shouldn't be looked upon as an enemy. Should be looked at as a potential asset. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Delete maybe political. All right, 11. England has a robust middle class. Most of the continent did not. If you were to look at the continent, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, you would have seen a large landlocked peasantry, often in serf, and then a top-heavy nobility. Okay? That makes them kind of, if they play their cards right, the nobles will be unbelievably territorial over the way that they earn a living. Okay, you want them to stay agricultural. You want them to be the breadbasket, because if agricultural production is the be-all, end-all in your economic system, then those that own the land own the means of production. Okay? If you innovate and you become commercial and you become industrial, you're inviting a middle class. And England had already had one. Okay? So that's another reason. So not conducive to transition from manufacturing commerce. A lot of the places were locked into an agricultural economy that supported noble dominance as landowners and maintained existing social structures. England had kind of already bypassed a lot of that. The Netherlands had kind of bypassed a lot of that. The places that were ultimately going to go quicker towards industrialization had a middle class that they could do that with. All right. So, if anybody was to say, why, Clayton, did the English have a decided industrial advantage circa 1850, you could say, I can think of like 11 things.
That's right.
And that would make you sound like a badass.
It would, and really
Okay.
smart.
And then you could say, what were the reasons why the continent was so far behind? And then you could say, I've got
All that stuff.
14 reasons. Except that some of them are redundant. But if you look at it, it's a lot of that, remember Spain failed, the Netherlands succeeded. A lot of the things that the Netherlands was doing right, the Spanish were not doing, and that's why they were failing. So you could make some of the same arguments here. England has a robust middle class, whereas continental Europe does not have a robust middle class. Okay? This is that part where, like the nobles, the decentralized nature of a lot of Central and Eastern European states, where the nobles are really the top of the food chain. Even, it's kind of like a pun because it's agricultural. They are protective of their assets. In fact, what you read about is that Central and Eastern Europe would rather trade with Western Europe or with Britain for industrial goods than to try to build those industries on their own. It's almost like they don't want their own people to see what they could build. It's like, that's that. I don't know where that stuff comes from, right? Because that keeps them in charge. All right. It's almost like keeping education away from people. Right, so that they don't know that they're being screwed, right? Keep them dumb. Keep them watching a lot of reality programming. All right, introduce a lot of like gadgets and a lot of like video games and things so that they can be playing while the world is crashing around them. Right? It might. Okay. I'll show you that. There's a really cool one because it has a quote from George Orwell. And then it has a picture of like all of these teenagers on their phones, like with their, doing their social media thing. It's something to the effect that, like he said, like, the people will not even recognize what's taking place because they're so, whatever it is. They're so blind to what's happening. And you get into some of these threads, like Karl Marx was trying to say that. Like organized religion had been used for years to try to keep people, hey, don't look here, look over here. Okay? And then once you get kind of post-religious, which a lot of Western civilization is now, you got to come up with things that fill the same role as religion. Okay? All right. The continent is not isolated, and that's another thing that they had to concern themselves with. The 1588, remember, allowed England the liberty to kind of do things at their own pace without the fear that somebody was going to invade them. All right, continental Europe, there could be an invading army at any given moment, and they didn't feel that kind of protection. Knowing that and constantly being on pins and needles, it's not really all that conducive to innovation. All right, so that's one of the arguments too. Number 4, the government is still absolutist in most places. Unlike England, they often did not cooperate with anyone, let alone an entrepreneurial class. Mercantilism is ideologically non-progressive because ideas that promote change are often stifled in favor of the father knows best mentality. All right? I alone can save the economy. All right? I know more than everybody else. Let me do it. All right? Instead of the more enlightened capitalists, let us, do it ourselves. Laissez-faire. Okay? Location. Once again, not just the fact that you had to worry about the invading armies, but that if you're landlocked, like what kind of naval and commercial and colonial power can frickin' Austria be? You know what I mean? Like some of these places were not, they didn't have that liberty. They weren't seaborne, empires. They were landlocked. In a lot of cases, didn't have a lot of access to navigable rivers, might be stuck in mountainous regions that made it very difficult for commerce to get from one place to the next. The social anxiety of the French Revolution and Napoleon years. These are peak years for the British industrial experiment. And the continent's getting ravaged by the French Revolution and Continental Wars. So they at least had that 25, 26-year period before they could really just kind of say, okay, now we can work on this other thing. All right. Number 7, shortage of laborers that had knowledge of industrial production. Okay. Most of them were, they're, like I said, you didn't have that mobile, like wage earning sort of group. You had tied to the land. We've been doing it this way since, the freaking Huns were here. Number 9 is more of a communication thing. That the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleonic eras isolated Britain, but that's also because then if Britain is sort of disconnected from the rest of the continent, then you can't exchange ideas that if Britain is doing this thing properly, that somebody else can learn from it. Okay. Steam-powered technology like the kind that Britain employed was not cheap, and a lot of these countries were struggling financially. Okay. Second, you needed government to get heavy involved in land reclamation. A lot of these places were swampy, and you had to clear a lot of land before you were ever going to be able to pave roads or to build railways. And without government supporting those capital ventures, there was really no chance for that to happen. Okay. Provincial tariffs. You guys remember my map of the Holy Roman Empire? Remember that? Okay. Well, imagine that at one time, remember, there was more than 360 different states or different political or religious entities that made up this thing called the Holy Roman Empire, and there could be a tariff between any one of them. All right? Some kind of problem, a different currency, some other regulation, some differentiation in language that kept this group from being able to trade with this group, or made it almost impossible for that to occur. Okay? That needed to be cleaned up, and it wasn't yet. All right? And then finally, the craft guilds. They mentioned the people that would have been involved in manufacturing were a hell of a lot more protective of their turf. The fact that they were the only show in town, that they had a skill set, and they weren't really going to want a whole bunch of machines to replace what they did very well and very lucratively. So the guilds are a lot more powerful in the continent than they were in England. Okay? Finally, and there are a handful of reasons why the continent was able to catch up. Now, Tatiana, I don't mean to put you on the spot. What would be the most obvious reason that the continent would be able to catch up? What if you were going to get involved in an industry that involved the production of wheels? Why would that be a little bit easier than the first person that tried to get involved in the wheel production industry?
Why would it be easier
for you than the very first wheel company?
Oh, because we have more access to different materials?
Maybe.
Well, there's a huge market for wheels now, and there wasn't in the past.
All right, so yeah, that's all true. What's the most common sense reason?
The wheel was already made.
The wheel's already made. That's it. Britain's done a lot of this. A lot of the technical know-how, that stuff's all gotten worked out. It just needs to be stolen. All right? That's how that works. It's a lot easier when somebody's already figured out how to build like a flying shuttle or a spinning jenny or some puddling furnace that's going to wipe out the impurities out of iron ore. That's done. So all you need to do is bribe somebody that knows how to do it. And that's a lot of what the continent was able to do, is that Britain did all the heavy lifting. Now all they had to do was steal what Britain did. All right, so that's the first thing. And you'll read some names here, okay? But that's it. Britain already did it. The tough part is the innovation. Britain took care of it. All the continent had to do was to beg, borrow, or steal, and that's what they did. Here's another example. some of the British were free agents, right? They said, you know what, I could be, you know, like these guys, the Cockerells. They're an example that you guys could use. But they were carpenters in Lancashire, all right? But in Lancashire, they could have been, like by the 18 teens or 20s, they could have been a dime a dozen. You know, it would be like having a fast food restaurant and saying, I think I'm going to put it on International Drive. You know, I'm thinking of forming a restaurant. I will put it on International Drive. You know what I mean? Like, what's going to do better? A Taco Bell on East Colonial or a Taco Bell in Kyrgyzstan? Well, we don't know, because we don't know if the Kyrgyzstanis would be down for the grade E meat that they serve in Taco Bell tacos. Or if they're down with the chalupa. We don't know. We don't know. But the thought of it is that whatever you are, by the time Britain is 60 or 70 years into those type of industries, there's a lot of competition around. So if you packed up and moved your expertise and know-how and business savvy to a different location in an industry that nobody's ever seen before, you got the market. Yeah? I know, at least this is pretty boring stuff.
No, I really like it.
All right. So it says, many English entrepreneurs took their shows on the road and set up industries in continental Europe. Then the third one, the example is this guy named Fritz Harcourt. And I like Fritz. His nickname was the Watt of Germany. And he's similar to me to like Marquis de Lafayette. All right? They had nothing to do with one another, other than Marquis de Lafayette, remember, was a military man who had fought in the American Revolution. Okay? That means that ultimately he gets to see it and witness it firsthand, and that it affects him in some sort of way. Harcourt was a Prussian military man who, during the Napoleonic campaigns, had a gig in Britain and got to like visit some of these like budding industrial towns and said, holy crap, look what you guys are doing. And said, I'm going back to Germany and I'm going to get me some of this stuff. I'm going to set, and not only that, but he was like, he knows what the geography of Germany looks like and how compatible it would be to the kind of things that we're setting up in England. They had huge industrial districts with huge iron ore deposits and coal deposits and populations that would just eat that stuff up. So his goal was to try to bring what England was succeeding in to Germany, and he ended up like bankrupting himself trying to do it. And part of the reason why was because the industry of interchangeable parts was not yet prominent. Do you know what that means?
Yeah.
Okay. So him trying to take the heavy machines and try to import those and then reset them up in Germany was way too costly and ended up blowing his fortune trying to get it done. All right. But it's initiative. Okay. Number 4 is called economic nationalism. And the figure there, his name is Frederick List, and in 1834 he wrote a work called National System of the Political Economy. Now this is the wake-up call, because for some of these folks, they identify themselves nationalistically. We Germans. And they do it in a way where it's already to the highest evolution of what that means. We Germans versus they somebody else. And in this case, it's they British, or those British, or the British. But it's a competition. And right now, Britain is mopping the floor with them. And so he saw it as a matter of national survival. Germany isn't even a nation yet, okay? But he's already thinking in those terms and said if the German people do not industrialize, they will not survive. They will not have a place in the world to hang their hat. Okay? Because Britain is the engine, Britain is the straw that stirs the drink, and there's not going to be enough left of that drink for anybody. So he says, we got to do this, and we got to do it in short order. All right? Number 5 was tariff protection. This is something that's going to come, but it's a recognition that we've already got past the idea that the continent is like, we got to industrialize. Now the question is, how do we do it? And tariff protection was necessary. And you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, what about Adam Smith? He's all a big free trader. The continent would get crushed in free trade. Does anybody understand why? Let's say, hey, I want to build polos. I want to make polos. You know, I want to set up these big textile plants here in, I don't know, East Württemberg.
Do they not have like the money for roads or something?
Huh?
Because like they can't travel through water, so how are they gonna?
It's not about traveling through water. It's about the idea that of free trade versus protected trade. Okay? So two things have got to happen. A, you have to be able to remove intrastate tariff barriers so that you can open up markets amongst yourselves. But you have to keep up high erected tariffs to protect yourself from the people that are doing it far better than you. All right? And right now, if there was an opportunity for Britain to be able to sell their goods in France or Germany or any of those other places, the German and French people wouldn't buy anything except the British stuff because they've been doing it a lot longer. They've been doing it for years. It's a higher quality. They do it in mass production. It's just better stuff. All right? So they got to at least keep that stuff out so that they can get strong enough to be able to build these industries on their own. All right? So they did that. Okay? The second thing was addressing the other thing, which was to try to remove internal barriers in trade. And this one's gigantic, folks. It's called the Zollverein. Please be familiar with it. Okay? Remember this. This is the Holy Roman Empire. You guys even had a semester exam question about the Holy Roman Empire, remember?
What?
Okay. By the time we got to Napoleon, it's circa 1808. Is it still going?
Yep.
All right. By the time we got to Napoleon, circa 1808, he said, you know, the Holy Roman Empire is a relic. It's stupid. Let's get rid of it. And he broke it into this 38 German state thing called the Confederation of the Rhine. And after Napoleon's defeated, the Germans are all meeting at Vienna, and they're like, you know what? Should we go back to the Holy Roman Empire? And they were like, no, man, that's stupid. Napoleon was right. Instead, let's just keep these 38 states. We'll call it the German Confederation. Okay? It's still not Germany, but that 360 has now been reduced to 38, 39 if you include Austria. All right? What the Zollverein did, and this is really the brainchild of Frederick List, was he tried to take those 38 states and turn them into one big free trade zone to eliminate the internal tariffs that... I'll just let it ring. Or maybe I'll change my voice. It's in my pocket, my coat pocket.
Use your words.
So anyway, what I was saying is there are 38 states in Germany that were having a very difficult time moving the olive oil industry from one place to the next. So the Zollverein did that. It eliminated that, and it literally, if you could say that the born-on date for German unification was 1871, but in reality it's 1834, because as an economic unit, they're already tied together. Okay, and the Zollverein is what did that. And it's really what energized German industry, okay, was to know that if I am involved in this type of production, whatever it happens to be, that I've got 38 trade partners. Okay, and that's a good thing. Number 7, government-backed investment. The governments had to do what Britain was doing, which was trying to take advantage of their entrepreneurial assets and trying to provide some financial backing so that they could get these things off the ground. And they started to pop up in abundance. You'll read about the Crédit Foncier. You'll read about the Crédit Mobilier. You'll read about the Crédit Anstalt, which was the German credit bank, okay? The Rothschilds banking family. This was like the financial capital that was needed to get these things going. And ultimately, that's what they got. And then number 8, anybody that took AP US should know how like integral to the development of the United States the railroads were. Okay, and certainly that's going to be the case in continental Europe. I mean, with all of its dirty laundry, of course. All right, but I mean, we haven't even gotten to that part next week, and we will. I mean, all of this stuff is done with dirty laundry. Okay, Britain is this industrial giant celebrated the year, you know, but like I told you, they did it with their foot on a whole bunch of poor people's throats. Okay, 7-8-year-old kids, you know, with lung problems because they've been breathing in coal dust all day. United States had that stuff too. All right, but the British, you know, there was literally no protection for the first 20 or 30 years. You know, you could do whatever the hell that you wanted. You know, I mean, there were towns in Britain at the height of the Industrial Revolution where the life expectancy was like 19 years old for the whole town. That's an average. Okay, so all of this might, you know, certainly happened at the expense of a lot of people. You know, like anything in the human civilization. Like, hey, great freaking pyramids, you know. You know. So, all right. Does anybody have any questions? I think we're going to stop there then, Jonah.
Gotcha.
It says by 1870 you have average